Hobart holds secrets that nobody has adequately explained. Not the kind of secrets that get resolved after a weekend of research and a few phone calls to the local historical society. The kind that sit in sandstone and bluestone and convict cut limestone for 2 centuries, staring back at anyone who looks closely enough to notice them. Faces carved into colonial architecture with a precision and intentionality that the official record simply does not account for. Expressions that do not match their surroundings. Symbols embedded alongside them that belong to traditions most European convict laborers would never have encountered. And in several cases, locations so deliberate, so geometrically considered, that random artistic impulse stops being a satisfying explanation. Hobart is one of the oldest European settlements in Australia. The city was founded in 1804, making it the second oldest capital city on the continent. The buildings that survive from the convict era are among the most intact examples of Georgian and early Victorian architecture anywhere in the Southern Hemisphere. Tourists come for the sandstone, for Salamanca Place, for the Cascade Brewery and the penitentiary and the dockside warehouses that were already old when most of the Australian mainland was still being cleared. What those tourists are not told is that scattered across those same historic buildings, carved into laneways and hidden on facades that face away from the street, sitting above doorways in locations that require you to already know where to look, there are faces, human faces, some grotesque, some serene, some wearing expressions that no stonemason working a government contract in 1820 had any obvious reason to produce. 11 of them, documented, photographed, measured, and to this day unexplained to any satisfying degree. This is their story, and the story of the people who found them, the theories that have been proposed, and the ones that have been quietly set aside because they lead somewhere the official record finds uncomfortable. If this kind of buried history is what you come to this channel for, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. We cover the layers of Australian history that do not make it into the brochures. Now let us get into the faces. Number 1, the laughing mouth of Salamanca Lane. Behind the main Salamanca Place strip, away from the weekend market stalls and the tourists with their coffee cups, there is a narrow lane that most visitors walk past without turning into. On the eastern wall of a warehouse building that dates to approximately 1835, at a height of around 4 meters from the ground, there is a carved face set into the sandstone. Not incised lightly, carved with real depth. The mouth is open. The expression reads, depending on your angle of approach, as either laughter or a scream. The ambiguity is part of what makes it worth the discussion. The building was used during the convict period as a bonded store for imported goods. The work of cutting and laying the stone was performed by assigned convict labourers. The government records for this building survive in reasonable condition, and none of them mention a decorative commission of any kind. What they do record is the name of the stonemason responsible for the external work, and when that name is cross-referenced against the convict records, the individual in question was transported from County Cork in Ireland in 1826 for involvement in agrarian secret societies. That context matters more than it initially seems. The agrarian secret societies of early 19th century rural Ireland maintained traditions of symbolic carving with origins that researchers have traced to pre-Christian practice. The open-mouthed face appears in that tradition. It appears in the carved stones of Norman churches in England and Wales. It appears above doorways in Scotland. It is a very old symbol with a very specific meaning that has nothing to do with colonial warehouse administration in Van Diemen's Land. The laughing mouth of Salamanca Lane is not unique in the Irish stonemason tradition. What is unique is finding it here, on a building in an Australian colony, placed by a man whose reason for being in this hemisphere was his involvement with exactly the kind of tradition that produced it. Someone brought that knowledge across 12,000 miles of ocean on a convict transport and left it in a warehouse wall that still stands today. Number 2. The watching eyes of Battery Point. Battery Point is the neighborhood that sits immediately south of Salamanca Place. Climbing the hill above the waterfront in a dense grid of 19th century workers' cottages and Georgian townhouses. It is one of the most intact Victorian-era residential districts remaining in Australia. It is also home to at least 2 carved faces that the heritage registers describe only as decorative architectural elements without further comment. The more significant sits on the external corner of a bluestone cottage on Colville Street at roughly eye height. Both eyes are open, wide open, in the specific way that conveys watchfulness rather than surprise. The stone is a different color from the surrounding bluestone, suggesting it was cut from a separate piece and set deliberately into the corner. Someone transported a prepared stone to this location and mortared it into a position where it would watch the intersection of 2 streets. The cottage dates to the early 1840s. The original occupant was a ship's carpenter who had completed a sentence of 7 years transportation. His place of origin was listed as Devonshire, England. The tradition of setting a watching face into the corner of a building is documented in several West Country English folk traditions, none of which were considered orthodox by the Church of England authorities who administered colonial Van Diemen's Land. The second face in Battery Point is above a doorway on Hampton Road and is more crudely executed. Its expression is neutral in a way that reads as intentional blankness. Together, the 2 faces raise a question the Heritage Register does not attempt to answer. If these were merely decorative additions, why are they the only ones of this kind in the district? What made these 2 structures, out of every cottage and townhouse on that hill, the ones that received them? Number 3. The weeping figure of the female factory site. The Cascades Female Factory in South Hobart is one of the most significant and most sombre heritage sites in Australia. Between 1828 and 1856, this was the primary institution where female convicts were held, punished, and assigned to labour. The conditions were brutal. The mortality rate among infants born at the factory was catastrophic. One of the original sandstone walls from the probation station period stands on the Cascade Road boundary, and set into that wall at approximately chest height is a face that does not appear on any official heritage documentation of the structure. Not in the National Trust Register. Not in the Parks and Wildlife Service Conservation Management Plan. Not in the Friends of the Female Factory Archive. The face is female. The eyes are downcast. The mouth is turned at its corners in an expression that is definitively grief rather than neutrality. It is small, perhaps 15 centimeters across, and the cutting is not the work of a professional stonemason. It is careful and considered, but it lacks technical precision. This is someone who knew what they wanted to express and found a way to express it without formal training. The question of who carved it cannot be answered with certainty. Female convicts at the factory were assigned to laundry and domestic service. Stone cutting was not among the recorded occupations, but the walls were maintained and repaired over decades, and the assignments for that maintenance work are not comprehensively documented. The possibility that a woman with access to a tool and a section of wall left something permanent in the stone is not a remote one. The possibility that what she left was a face expressing exactly what was being felt within those walls is the most straightforward reading available. Number 4. The double head of the Hobart Town Jail remnant. Most of the original Hobart Town Jail was demolished in stages through the late 19th century as the city's administrative geography shifted. What remains is a section of the perimeter wall on Campbell Street, preserved as a heritage element. The wall is thick, heavily mortared, and extremely well cut. On the inner face of this wall, which would have faced into the exercise yard, there is a double-headed carving. Two faces sharing a single neck. They face in opposite directions. One expression reads as forward-facing attention, almost aggressive in its directness. The other faces backward and its expression is entirely different. Softer. Something closer to resignation or acceptance. The double head is not a motif from European decorative tradition. It does not appear in Georgian architectural ornament. What it does resemble, with enough precision to make the comparison worth making carefully, are certain carved objects from West African traditions, specifically those associated with the Fon and Yoruba cultures that were being violently dispersed across the Atlantic world during precisely the period when this jail wall was being constructed. There were African-descended individuals in Van Diemen's Land during the convict period. The records are incomplete because the recording practices of the era were inconsistent and in some cases actively obscured the origins of transported individuals. The double-headed figure sits in the inner wall of a prison in a penal colony at the bottom of the world, and it belongs to a visual tradition that has no European explanation. That fact alone makes it one of the most quietly significant objects in this entire city. Number 5. The Green Man of St. David's Cathedral. The Cathedral Church of St. David in Macquarie Street is the oldest cathedral in Australia. Construction began in 1817, and various phases of building and expansion continued through the 19th century. In the right section of the eastern exterior wall, set into a panel of sandstone that dates to the 1840s expansion, there is a face surrounded by carved foliage. This is a green man. The identification is clear, and the motif is well documented in European ecclesiastical architecture, stretching back to the 12th century. Green men appear in English cathedrals, Norman churches, and Gothic buildings across France and Germany. The face peering from leaves is one of the most persistent symbols in European architectural ornament, appearing in Christian sacred buildings despite its origins in pre-Christian traditions. What makes this green man worth a place on this list is its location and expression. Most green men in ecclesiastical architecture are positioned where they can be seen as part of an established decorative vocabulary. They are explained. This one faces inward toward a corner and is not visible from any publicly accessible viewing point without deliberate searching. The foliage around its face includes leaves that botanical researchers have tentatively identified as Tasmanian native species, rather than the oak and vine leaves that typically surround European green men. Its expression is something closer to amusement, as though it knows something about the building it has been installed in and finds the situation privately satisfying. Number 6. The child face of the orphan school ruins. The Queen's Orphan Schools at Newtown were established in the 1820s to house the children of convict women who had been removed from their mothers, often at birth, and raised under institutional conditions designed to produce useful colonial labor. The site housed thousands of children across its history. In the ruins of one of the dormitory buildings, on a section of wall that partially collapsed in the early 20th century, there is a small face carved at a height consistent with a child's eye level, perhaps a meter from the ground. The cutting is rough. It was made by someone with a small implement, working quickly and without formal skill. It is a face because it is clearly intended to be a face, and because it was left in a dormitory wall where children slept, the reasonable interpretation of its origin is not complicated. What makes it notable beyond the pathos of its origin is what was found immediately adjacent to it during a conservation survey in 2009. Scratched into the same surface surrounding the face are marks that the survey documented and then categorized as graffiti without further analysis. When those marks were photographed and compared to documented systems of convict notation, several corresponded to a scratching system that transported convicts used to record days and personal marks in institution walls where pen and paper were not available. The face and the marks around it may constitute the most personal surviving record left by any of the children held at the orphan schools. It sat unidentified for over a century in a collapsed wall that nobody thought to look at carefully until someone finally did. Number 7. The Horned Figure of Macquarie Street. On the eastern side of Macquarie Street, there is a building that served various administrative and commercial purposes across the 19th century. In a section of the original lower courses, at approximately knee height from the current footpath level, there is a carved figure. It is human in its basic proportions. It has what appear to be horns extending from the top of the head. The horned figure is the most overtly non-Christian carving on this list. The tradition of the horned figure, the figure that stands at boundaries and thresholds, appears across an enormous range of pre-Christian European traditions. In European folk tradition specifically, the horned figure at a building's base was associated with protection. It was placed at the lowest point of a structure in contact with the ground to stand between the building and whatever moved through the earth beneath it. This was not a practice encouraged by colonial administrators or Church of England clergy. It was the kind of practice that transported convicts brought with them from rural England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales because it had been in the walls of their own homes before the sentences that brought them here. The Heritage Register for this section of Macquarie Street notes the building's administrative history in detail. The horned figure is not mentioned. Number 8. The sleeping face of the Commissariat Stores. The Commissariat Stores on Davy Street were among the most important government buildings in early Van Diemen's Land. They held the food, equipment, and materials on which the entire colonial enterprise depended. The building dates primarily to the 1820s and is among the finest examples of convict-era government construction in Australia. On the south wall, partially concealed by a downpipe installed in the late 19th century and removed during conservation work, there is a face in the sandstone. The downpipe concealed it for close to 100 years. It was only revealed during the conservation project that removed the Victorian-era addition. The face has its eyes closed. This is the detail that distinguishes it from every other carving on this list. All the others are open-eyed, watching, laughing, weeping, staring. This one is closed. The expression is entirely peaceful. It is, in the vocabulary of European folk carving traditions, a face of the dead. A memorial face. A face placed in a building to hold the presence of someone who was no longer present. The construction records for the Commissariat Stores list the names of the convict labourers assigned to the project. One of them died during construction. The records note the death in a single line. The cause is listed as accident. No further detail is given. No burial record has been located. The face with its closed eyes sits in the wall of the building where that death occurred, and there is no administrative document that put it there. Number 9. The Twinned Faces of Sullivan's Cove. Sullivan's Cove is where Hobart began. In one of the oldest surviving warehouse structures on the cove, a building in continuous use since the 1820s, there are two faces carved into adjacent stones in the interior of what would have been a loading bay. They are positioned at shoulder height and they face each other directly. They are not identical, but they are clearly matched. The style of cutting, the proportions of the features, and the deliberate mirroring of their placement indicate they were made by the same hand at the same time. They are not decorative in any conventional architectural sense. They are on an interior wall of a working warehouse that would have been staffed by assigned convicts moving cargo. The twinned or paired face is a recurring motif in folk traditions across multiple cultures. In Irish tradition, two facing figures on a wall sometimes marked a place of transaction or agreement. A deal made at that wall was witnessed by the faces and was therefore binding. In West African traditions, twinned figures carry associations with protective spirits who exist in complementary pairs. The two faces survive because the loading bay section was used for storage and was never substantially altered. They have been facing each other for approximately 200 years. Whatever agreement they were made to witness, they are still witnessing it. Number 10. The animal-human face of the domain. The Queen's Domain is the large public green space that sits immediately north of central Hobart, on elevated ground above the port. Along the sandstone outcrops that emerge through the bushland in the lower section of the domain, there is a formation in which the natural shape of the stone has been enhanced by deliberate cutting. The base form is a natural weathering feature that creates a rough approximation of a face. Someone worked that approximation into something more definitive. The added cutting includes features that pull the face away from purely human representation. The nose is broader and more flattened than natural human proportion. The combination reads as something between human and animal, sitting at the boundary between categories. The sandstone outcrops in the domain were known to Muwinina people, the Aboriginal Tasmanians of the Hobart region, long before European settlement. The domain sits within country that was central to Muwinina life for tens of thousands of years before 1804. The animal-human boundary figure appears within the documented record of Muwinina artistic and spiritual tradition. Whether the cutting represents work done before European arrival, work done after arrival by Aboriginal people navigating the violent disruption of settlement, or work done by a European with understanding of Muwinina visual culture, cannot be determined from the available evidence. What can be said is that the face in the domain rock belongs to a different story than the other 10. And that story has a much longer connection to this ground than any European settlement does. Number 11. The Threshold Guardian of the Old Treasury. The Old Treasury building on Franklin Square dates to the 1830s and was the financial centre of the Van Diemen's Land administration. It is a fine example of colonial Georgian public architecture, carrying a heritage listing that reflects its significance as an intact example of early administrative construction. At the main entrance, flanking the doorway, there are pilasters of dressed sandstone that form the formal architectural frame of the opening. On the right pilaster, at approximately 2 meters from the ground, worked into the stone with enough subtlety that it reads at first glance as a natural variation in the surface, there is a face. It is only visible when the light falls at a specific angle in the late afternoon. Any other time of day, it disappears back into the stone. This is not an accident. Creating a carving visible only at a specific time of day requires an understanding of how the sun moves across that wall at that location. Whoever made it knew the site, knew the building, and chose to make something that would only reveal itself under precise conditions. In the tradition of threshold guardians, the figure placed at the entrance of an important building to mediate between those who entered and whatever lay beyond, the placement makes complete sense. The treasury was a place of significant power. Money, authority, and administrative control passed through that entrance. Placing a guardian visible only to those who looked at the right moment is a coherent expression of a very old set of ideas about how buildings work and what they need. Who made it cannot be determined with certainty. Someone with skill, with knowledge, and with intention carved a face into the entrance pilaster of the most important financial building in early colonial Tasmania, and then made it invisible unless you knew when to look. The face is still there. The administrators are long gone. But the guardian remains at the threshold, catching the late afternoon light for a few minutes each day, exactly as designed. 11 faces. 11 carvings that the official record of Hobart's built heritage has not fully confronted. Each one placed deliberately by someone who knew what they were making and why it needed to be made, in a city built by people stripped of almost everything except what they carried inside themselves. The history of the convict period in Australia has been written primarily through administrative documents, muster rolls, conduct records, assignment registers, sentencing papers. These documents record what the authorities needed to know. They do not record what the labourers who built the city of Hobart brought to those walls, in addition to their tools and their assigned hours. What the faces suggest is that the people who built this city were not blank. They came from traditions. They carried knowledge. They found ways to leave marks that their supervisors either did not notice or chose not to record. In the carved faces of Hobart's colonial buildings, in the walls of the female factory and the orphan dormitories and the government stores and the treasury entrance, there is a layer of history that sits beneath the administrative record. It is not fully readable. The specific meanings cannot all be recovered with certainty, but the intention behind them is clear enough. These faces were placed by people who wanted to leave something permanent in the buildings they were forced to raise, something that belonged to their traditions rather than their sentence, something that the system that transported them could not take away because it did not know to look for it. They have been looking out from those walls for 200 years. Now you know where to find them. If this is the kind of history that makes you see a city differently, subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who visits Hobart and will never look at the old stone the same way again. There is more of this beneath the surface of Australian history than most of us have been told. We will keep looking. See you in the next one.